Good afternoon and good morning, depending on your time zone. I'm Floyd Hall, the creative producer for Science Gallery Atlanta, and thank you for joining us for this conversation. This is entitled Drugs in Your Neighborhood, Race, Place, and Community. A conversation with Dr. Kay Levine and journalist Ann Marie Awad. Thank you to our audience, but thank you, of course, to our panelists, Kay and Ann Marie. I'm so thrilled to have this conversation with the both of you. I know we've had a couple conversations prior to this moment, but I'm super excited to sort of get both of y'all's perspectives on this notion of drugs and race and place. I think that you all, come to this conversation from two different spaces, but I love what you all bring to this conversation. Kay, you're from Emory Law, and so you've done lots of research around, I think, how drugs and local prosecution, prosecutorial decisions, if you will, sort of impact the spaces that we live in. And Ann Marie, as the host of On Something, the podcast, you've done lots of research around, I think, just how different cities and states sort of address, again, drug policy, legalization, and how all that affects, I think, how we live in certain places. And so just super glad to have you all as part of this conversation today. We're also joined by Sarah Idris Muhammad, who is one of our student mediators. Sarah will be posing some questions later on in this conversation. But so to kick this off, I would love for Kay and Anna Marie to maybe talk about like the earliest sense of what a drug policy even looked like, or like sort of like the origin story of how we began to think about drugs as an organized, I guess, government or sort of city or sort of just as an ongoing concern within our local, I guess, policy places. So, Kay, if you could sort of give a bit of a backstory on that.
Sure, I would be happy to. And Floyd, thank you so much for inviting me and for putting this presentation together. Ann Marie, I'm looking forward to a really interesting conversation. I hope the audience is not expecting sparks to fly, because I think we're probably in alignment on lots of things.
Yeah, no, I think we get along too well.
Okay, great. So I want to make a point to our audience members that even though we tend to think of drug policy in the United States as something that is very recent, and just in the last 40 years, in fact, the first anti-drug legislation that existed in the United States arose in 1874 in the state of California. So ironically, right, we think of California as being very forward-thinking, very liberal on drug policy, but California was the first state to enact drug policy, limiting the smoking of opium. It was targeted against the Chinese immigrant population, who posed a labor market threat to the whites who were working in the mines and on the railroads. So that predated the passage of the Harrison Act, which is really the first federal drug prohibition law. Harrison Act was in 1914. So California was already sort of getting in the game on this in 1874. That is decades before the first federal enactment. The opium smoking linkage to the Chinese immigrant workers is really the first example that we see in the United States of using drug policy as a way to address concerns in the labor market. So we can see this story play out in the prohibition against opium smoking, which targeted the Chinese immigrants. We see the same story happening with cocaine. There was a hysteria around cocaine in the first couple of decades of the 20th century. Around World War I, it coincided, I think not at all surprisingly, with lynching and voter restriction laws, other aspects of the Jim Crow legislation in the South. And then we see the next iteration and the prohibitions against marijuana also starting in the southwestern states, California, Texas, Utah, marijuana legislation being used to target Mexican immigrants who were providing lower wage labor than what whites were willing to provide in farming communities. So we see the first prohibitions against marijuana in 1919. We don't see the Marijuana Tax Act federally until 1937. So the point I want to make for our listeners is that the origins of drug policy, drug prohibitions, every single story like this, it all begins at the state level. These grassroots campaigns happening at the state level, where there's this convergence of concerns around race and labor and drug use. And those are long preceding actions that are being taken at the federal level to have any kind of national impact.
Yeah, and I think something that has been really interesting going over the history of these laws on our show, just talking to a lot of historians, is like these laws have a tendency to have very explicit racial outcomes for certain groups, like you're saying. And I think there's an expectation that laws that are racist will announce themselves as racist and say like, hey, look over here. But I think with a lot of these drug laws that Kay just mentioned, like the impact is very clear. That not only the people who suffer for these laws tend to fall into one particular racial group, but also the support for these laws is propagated through stereotypes, racial stereotypes. Opium, I was just reading up on this morning, actually. Opium at that time was considered to be something that was smoked by Chinese immigrants and prostitutes. And so there was not a lot of political support for these groups. So it passed rather easily. The same thing you see with the Marijuana Tax Act. Several states started prohibiting marijuana because it was linked to Mexicans. And I think in particular, something that's really interesting to note is that at the start of this century, cannabis was a legal medicine here in the United States. And the word cannabis typically referred to like a liquid formulation that you could get from a pharmacist. About a couple decades later, around the time that the Marijuana Tax Act rolled around, states had moved to prohibit marijuana, which they saw as distinct from cannabis. And it wasn't, what you were getting in a bottle from your pharmacist. It was something that was being smoked. And in particular, the racial stereotype at the time was that only Mexican people smoked it or Black people smoked it. And so a lot of the sort of like politicking around the Marijuana Tax Act in 1937 before it passed had to do with sort of regulating these racial groups. It wasn't always explicitly put that way, but that was the outcome too.
Now, as we think about further into our nation's history, we have mentions of policy that sort of targets Chinese. We have policy that sort of targets Mexicans, and I guess when do we start to see policies that I guess target Blacks or African Americans? Is that further on into it? Is there a different drug that sort of relates to that? How do we sort of continue to unpack that?
So I can jump in. The hysteria around cocaine that started around the early part of the 20th century was explicitly focused on newly freed Blacks. The chattel slavery has officially dissolved, but Blacks and lower class whites are competing for jobs in the labor market and around the emergence of the 20th century. There were a lot of employers in the farming communities in the South who preferred Black workers over white workers. The Blacks were much less likely to unionize. Blacks were used as strike breakers. And so lower class whites in those communities became very concerned about Blacks taking jobs away from whites. So the hysteria around cocaine that we tend to associate with the crack scares of the Reagan administration actually started many decades earlier. But it sort of course, it took on new life, I think, starting with the Nixon war on poverty and war on drugs in 1971. And then we could say it sort of took on a life of its own, like it sort of became amplified during the Reagan years. We see the Anti-Drug Abuse Acts of 1986 and 1988, which famously enshrined the crack to powder ratio of 100 to 1 in terms of how much, in terms of simple possession, what sort of quantity would elevate you into very serious prison time. So the crack powder ratio was enacted during the Reagan years and not dismantled until the Obama years. So it was in effect for decades. But again, just like the points I was raising earlier about opium and marijuana and the early cocaine years, we actually saw more draconian punishments enacted at the state level before we got to the Reagan administration. So states as diverse as New York and Michigan in the 1970s were the ones who were enacting what we would now think of as draconian drug laws. And those were diluted or dismantled in the early 2000s, but that is what created the platform for very striking disparities among African Americans and whites, particularly around cocaine, that generally we think of as characterizing the last decades of the 20th century.
I do want to emphasize this point that you're making, or at least this correlation that you're making, Kay, in that the characterization of drugs or certain drugs as a problem is tied to labor and market forces. Like that's the thing that it still is hard to wrap my mind around, because I think in many ways we look, or it's sort of presented to us, or drugs are presented to us as a bit of a moral problem, or that there are these like hyper local, hyper community focused, or like social challenges that we're facing, right? That are driving how we think about drugs, but to tie it to economics, labor, and the actual labor market feels really enlightening to me. Could you just maybe help us unpack that a little bit more, if you could?
Yeah, I'm happy to. And then I would love to hear more from Ann Marie, because she has much more information about cannabis and how this has worked within the Mexican farming community. But I think I would say for a long time, the story that we told about drugs was very much about elites oppressing disadvantaged populations. But when we take a close look at the labor story, that means that there is a lot of grassroots support and grassroots among the sort of lower class and middle class white communities for enacting these very oppressive measures. It's not just the elites who were designating themselves the moral entrepreneurs, that's the word we use in sociology, setting moral standards. The kind of moral panic around drugs was part and parcel of a labor market panic at each of these stages. And that's really what gave it teeth. So sociologists have unearthed lots of documents, lots of writings by the people who were at the forefront of the AFL, the labor movement, the organizations that eventually gave rise to the AFL-CIO, who were the ones writing op-eds in local newspapers decrying the use of drugs by these populations, creating the sense of panic in the local populations that ultimately gave support to the legislatures who were passing these laws. So I think if we only focus on the elite oppression story, we're missing a really important part of where drug laws came from and ultimately why they continue to be sustained. Given that every time criminologists do population studies of drug use, we see similar levels of drug use for all of these drugs across every racial group, and yet the laws remain in place. So there's got to be some deeper explanation than just elites oppressing disadvantaged populations. These laws are serving a purpose, continue to serve a purpose in lots of different ways, even once the elites have receded from the moral panic story.
Yeah, I actually think this is a really powerful line of logic, because when you look at cannabis, it's a very similar story. 1937, when the Cannabis Tax Act went into law, is in the middle of the Great Depression. And it's really important to note that Mexican Americans at that time are among the first people who lose their jobs during the Great Depression. And there is still like a anti-Mexican animus at the time that sounds a lot like they're taking our jobs, even as everybody's losing their job. Around this time too, the federal government undertakes an arrangement with the Mexican government to mass deport millions. We actually don't know to this day how many, but it's expected to be in the millions of Mexicans and Mexican Americans. I think something like a third are thought to have been citizens born here. And so this, I think, was particularly potent in certain parts of the country where you were seeing a lot of influx of Mexicans and Mexican Americans. So if you look at what's happening when marijuana becomes federally illegal, like a generation before, tons of people migrate from Mexico and settle in the Southwest. And so when marijuana becomes illegal and the enforcement starts to pick up, a lot of the people who are arrested are Mexican. However, you have kind of a different situation in more northern states where the focus is really more on Black people. And I think again, going back to this link between drug policy and labor, Black people at this time are achieving unprecedented financial independence. The Harlem Renaissance is going on around this time. Like, it is a good time for Black Americans. And so this comes about as like a way to sort of regulate them. And I think, again, when you look at sort of like a lot of the rhetoric that comes about in the run up to the Marijuana Tax Act in the 30s, a lot of it has to do with, marijuana enables racial mixing. So in certain parts of the country, you may be concerned about Mexicans consuming marijuana and using that as an impetus for racial mixing. And somewhere else in the country, you might be concerned about Black Americans doing the same thing. And I think that's where a lot of the popular support for these types of laws comes from. And Kay is absolutely right. It kind of transcends class, but not race.
So I'd love to add 2 footnotes to that. One is that if we think about why we had this influx of Mexican labor during World War I and during the Great Depression, we could tie it directly to the Chinese Exclusion Acts of the late 1800s, right? That we had, as a country, decided to kick out many of the Chinese immigrants, and yet when we have the turn of the century, we have the need for low wage labor, jobs that whites are not willing to take, and many people are off fighting the wars, or they come back disabled. We still have a need for labor in the farms, and so that generates this need for Mexican labor that then contributes to this the confluence of marijuana policy and immigration policy to disadvantage the Mexican Americans who are here taking jobs that many whites did not want to take. The second point I wanted to raise is that I'm so glad Ann Marie brought up the gender dimension, because in every single one of these drug prohibition eras, we see a direct linkage to white women are going to get sucked in and sort of end up in this corrupt drug culture with minority men. We see it with there were newspaper stories about Chinese men seductively using opium to draw white women into their opium dens. We see it as part of the cocaine panic in 1915, 1920. African Americans hyped up on cocaine will be raping white women, right? That was part of the lynching story. It's also true with the marijuana story that Ann Marie was telling, the idea that white women are going to get sucked into this drug culture. So in addition to the labor story and the race story, there is absolutely a gender relations story in every single one of these patterns that we've seen for the last 140 years.
So in thinking about what you said earlier, in terms of a lot of these policies starting at the local level and then rising up to the federal level, and sort of intersecting with, race, labor, immigration, all the things that you all just mentioned. At what point do these policies take on formalization? And so I guess what I really want to say is, how do we begin to organize how we're classifying these drugs so that we can better administer the policy? So thinking about certain drug schedules and how that kind of comes to be. Ann Marie, could you maybe talk about like how the whole drug scheduling sort of system began and how it even works?
Yeah. So speaking of the Marijuana Tax Act, it was one of the first accomplishments for a guy named Harry Anslinger, who was the head of federal drug policy in this country for about 30 years, from the early 20th century up until the Nixon administration, I believe. And so the Marijuana Tax Act is like his first big achievement. And I would say that the Controlled Substances Act later on in 1967 is like his lifetime achievement. And so this was the culmination of not only so many different state policies kind of being formalized in federal law, but also international treaties around opium trafficking, cannabis, and other certain substances. So it's not a linear thing, but there are a couple linear elements of how we get from like the Marijuana Tax Act to there. One of them is every drug law, more or less, that is passed at the federal level between those two, just amps up penalties for use, possession, and trafficking. And that pattern doesn't necessarily stop with the Controlled Substances Act. Another thing to really note is the scheduling system has remained largely unchanged since the law went into effect in 1967. And so KU actually forwarded a really great article about this morning. But we made a choice as a country in 1967 that certain drugs were very dangerous, high potential for abuse, and no medicinal potential. And those drugs are cannabis, but also LSD, mushrooms, heroin. That is all Schedule 1. So those are considered kind of like the most dangerous. Schedule 2 is dangerous, but there is a medicinal application. So that's where you find, I believe, opiates, methamphetamines, and other, I think like Ritalin and other medications like that.
Cocaine is in there as well.
Cocaine as well. Schedule 3, this is where I start to get a little bit foggy. There's 5 schedules. Schedule 3 through 5 is kind of where you start getting to things that are available with a prescription or sometimes available over the counter, like cough syrup with codeine in it. Or CBD was actually Schedule 3 for a long time, which is, yes, very confusing. And so really, like, we have this regime of scheduling drugs that is really first and foremost preoccupied with medicinal value. But at the same time, really restricts research into a lot of those drugs. So the Controlled Substances Act still maintains that cannabis has no medicinal value, but something like 30 plus states in the United States disagree with that by now. And it's not as though there is like a ton more research. It's actually that the Controlled Substances Act prohibits a lot of research into cannabis, but it doesn't take into account that more than half of the country is using it anyways. So what's also ironic about the Controlled Substances Act right now is like we're locked into a situation where cannabis, for example, is legal for most of the country. We can't study it though. We can't study the health effects. We can't study its medicinal value. And so it's a giant catch-22.
I do want to give one bit of a plug to the On Something podcast, because I think in one of the earliest episodes, maybe season 1, I think, Ann Marie, there was a story about a woman who was a doctor who was having surgery. And I think maybe she was studying cannabis, was having surgery and could not get prescribed cannabis, but was sort of circumventing the system to have access to that particular health benefit for her. And it just kind of created this really interesting conundrum, or like, I think, confluence of like how all of these policy measures kind of coincide with one another. And I would just recommend folks to go listen to the podcast to hear more about that story. But I just think that like there's interesting layers on top of layers on usage, on access, but then even challenges to being able to actually like study the drug, to do more research, to see what it could potentially unlock.
I think that's exactly right. And so, you know, when we think about the schedules, what Congress has put in Schedule 1 are drugs they decide have no medicinal value and a strong potential for addiction. So, but Ann Marie is exactly right. Like by putting something in that classification, they depress the ability of addiction and public health researchers to actually establish medical usages. So there's this really weird, we say endogeneity effect or feedback loop problem. And the things that are Schedule 3, Schedule 4, yeah, like Tylenol with codeine, and you know, so those things are fairly uncontroversial. But we also see, you know, the continuing location in the lower schedules of things like Xanax, which nowadays many people realize has significant potential for addiction, even though it also has medical value. So I think, you know, addiction researchers have been trying to change the conversation around the relative importance of medicinal value and addictive potential. And one of the things that's always said around marijuana is, well, there are lots of recreational users, so that presents a big problem of addiction. And yet addiction research usually say, but lots of recreational users never develop an addiction to marijuana. That's sort of what makes them recreational, is they can sort of take it or leave it on any given day or week or month or whatever. But in terms of Congress speak, the sheer number of users of marijuana around the country presents this problem that many people may get addicted to it. Ann Marie also mentioned the treaty issue. We continue to be signatories, we, the United States, to treaties that require cannabis to continue to be a controlled substance in either category 1 or category 2. And so the potential for the US to take itself out of compliance with these treaties if we significantly reduce the place of cannabis in the schedule is significant. And as you know, the United States has a lot of our framework for our interaction with other nations around the globe is layered and multidimensional, and you know, drug policy is one piece of that, but it's only one piece of that. So we have to ask ourselves, are we willing to take ourselves out of compliance with these other treaties and perhaps set ourselves in a disadvantageous position vis-a-vis other countries that we normally consider our allies, just to take a different stance on the issue of cannabis internally? These are hard problems to solve.
I also just want to tack on one final point about the Controlled Substances Act. So like this tension between medicinal value and abuse is really hard to like quantify. And there isn't, like, the law doesn't specify any criteria for what abuse is. And so you have like another really great example of how the Controlled Substances Act makes this all a little bit needlessly complicated is like the fact that testosterone is a Schedule, I believe, 2 or 3 substance, which puts roadblocks in place for trans people who want to access it. And so we can kind of sit here and talk about what constitutes abuse for something like that and what constitutes medicinal value. But a lot of research would tell you that there is intense medicinal value to gender affirming care for trans people. And so more broadly, you just see like the Controlled Substances Act, again, hasn't been changed a lot since the 60s and really is way out of step with the way that most Americans are interacting with drugs or interacting with healthcare. Yeah.
So for the sake of this conversation, I wanted to remind everyone who is in the audience that we are monitoring the chat box as well as the Q&A box. So if you have questions for Ann Marie or for Kay, please feel free to drop those questions in and we'll work those in as they kind of flow with the conversation. And I think there's, you know, the natural tendency is to maybe shift to how, you know, I guess how all of this plays out in a very hyper local sense. But to sort of get us there, I would love to get you all's perspective of information and like how do we as individuals typically find out even what the drug policies that govern our communities actually are? Like, how would someone even know what drug policy is in a particular community, city, government? You know, like, how does that even work?
So I'll start here by saying, you know, we need to acknowledge that there's the formal law, and that is, you know, what is prohibited at the federal level. You know, that's the Controlled Substances Act, and then there are various statutes that would tell us what the penalties are for being in possession of that sort of drug, being in possession with intent to sell, selling, trafficking, etc. So we have a whole federal statutory scheme that talks about that. Very few cases end up in federal court. So, you know, in truth, like if you are on a sailboat and you pull into the harbor in Miami and your sailboat is found to possess 1,200 pounds of heroin, chances are that's going to be a federal case. But what I tell my students is, you know, you're stopped at a stop sign, you roll a stop sign, an officer pulls up to you, and it turns out there's a little bit of something in your ashtray. Chances are that's a state case. So it's much more likely that the state laws are going to be relevant than that the federal laws are going to be relevant, because so few defendants really end up in federal court. At the state level, we have state statutes that prohibit the possession with intent to sell, the sales and trafficking and manufacture and cultivation of lots and lots of these drugs. So the decriminalization schemes that have taken root, no pun intended, for marijuana in the last 5 years or so really have not had any effect on the laws about methamphetamine, cocaine, Xanax, heroin, etc. But beyond just what the state laws say are illegal and what the punishments are, drug policy is very much about your interaction with police and then what prosecutors do with your case. And that is not controlled at all by what the state laws say. The state laws sort of provide an outer framework, but very at the very intense level, it's about whether police are going to intercept you. If they intercept you, do they search you? If they search you, do they find something in your pocket or the console of your car? And if they find something, are they then going to forward it on to the prosecutor's office? And there's a lot of information about racial profiling and policing, police departments targeting certain neighborhoods. So this is where we see the disparity between what criminologists find are patterns of drug usage across the population and police reports documenting who they're arresting for those particular drugs. So in Atlanta, for example, where I am, the vast majority of defendants that are coming through on drug charges are African Americans, but that is not indicative of drug use across the population of Atlanta. And then at the prosecutor's office, they get police reports, and then prosecutors decide, do I want to file charges against this person? And if I do I want to decrease from what the police recommend? Do I want to increase from what the police recommend? And prosecutor choices about whether to file and what to file are almost entirely discretionary. There is very little formal law that tells prosecutors what they have to do or can't do. As long as they fit within the abstract framework of the state law, a prosecutor in a given office can do pretty much whatever he or she wants. And that means we see a lot of disparity county to county. So I'm here in Fulton County. The way Fulton County handles drug cases is markedly different than the way cases are handled in the northern and southern areas of the state of Georgia, which are more rural, less urban, and tend to be led by prosecutors who are less progressive in terms of drug policy.
Yeah, I love this question because I don't have a great answer to it. Like, I don't know where people find out about their drug policy information. In fact, a lot of the people we interviewed on the show were caught off guard, sort of didn't know until they encountered the criminal justice system or the administrative law apparatus, whatever it is. And so, I think like one really unfortunate example of that is that we had interviewed a non-citizen who was visiting this country as a tourist. And she visited Colorado. She tried one weed edible because she thought it was legal. And then she goes back home. She's going through customs at the airport, and they go through her phone first, and they ask, hey, you have a couple pictures from a dispensary. Did you try cannabis while you were in Colorado? And she said, yes, it's legal. She got deported immediately and is still appealing for her right to access the United States. She's banned for life from the United States. That's perfectly legal. Non-citizens do not actually have to be convicted or even charged of a crime before they're just, thrown out. And so the unfortunate reality is that I can think of a ton of situations where that's the case, in terms of just like parents who have kids who are medical marijuana patients and who could be doing everything right according to the law and still have like a child protective services case opened up against them. And like Kay said, it really is political. It depends on the individual, caseworker at Child Protective Services and how they perceive cannabis in a household with a kid. And it is also very regional. Like I'm here in Denver, Colorado. I can point to Colorado's most conservative congressional district, which happens to overlap with Colorado Springs, which is like an hour south. That is where much more cannabis convictions tend to happen. That is where judges tend to be a lot harsher on cannabis. There's not full legal cannabis actually allowed in Colorado Springs. And so, yeah, drug policy, unfortunately, tends to take most average people by surprise.
So with that being the case, I would love to maybe even recap or even expand sort of who has the local agency in communities to affect how what your path might be in terms of your interaction when it comes to drugs. So you have arresting officers, you have local prosecutors, you have caseworkers in that instance that you just mentioned, and Marie, you have, are there city councils that kind of get to say what things happen in certain local jurisdictions? I feel like there's a lot of overlapping local agency where the individual, any of us, may be at the mercy of different outcomes or different interests. 1 mile this way, 1 mile that way could be totally different.
Well, and sorry.
No, go ahead. No.
I was just going to say quickly, like you in the South, it's more common for your judges and your sheriffs to be elected figures, which also adds a whole other layer to it.
It does, yeah, it absolutely does. And so, so Floyd, you mentioned the city council piece. So, city councils can enact regulations, and so one thing that city councils have done in a lot of places is create drug-free commercial zones. They have designated whole sections of the city to be subject to heightened penalties for people who are caught possessing with intent to sell or selling or trafficking in those zones. And those city councils basically are sort of taking information from community leaders and so forth about the impact on commercial districts. And then they decide by vote that they're going to create this commercial zone that then police officers are charged with enforcing in terms of making the arrest, and prosecutors whether they actually want to file the charge. But the other thing that city council can do, at least in certain places, and here I'm thinking of California, is decide on the legalization scheme. So while the fact of marijuana decriminalization across California got a lot of press, I think people don't realize what California actually did when it passed on the ballot. It said, as a statewide matter, we're now going to leave it to localities to decide how legal they want to make cannabis in their own regions. And that means that each city council got to decide for itself, do we want to have cannabis businesses within the border of our city? So there's been some interesting work showing that even though there was widespread support in the abstract for cannabis legalization, there are a lot of city councils that have said, but we don't want any of those shops in our locality. So the result is that if you are in California, you can. It's not the case that across all 58 counties in that state, you can find cannabis easily and legally and cheaply. In many instances, like if you're in the city of Santa Monica, which is a division of Los Angeles, Santa Monica showed great support for the abstract legalization of cannabis, but they said not in our backyard when it came to housing cannabis shops. So that's a really important thing to keep in mind, is that city councils can constrain the availability of drugs that even that many people in the population believe ought to be widely available. So that's part of their sort of local police power for issuing licenses and permits for all kinds of businesses that remain kind of on the bubble in terms of legitimacy. Legalization is not the same thing as legitimacy, and I think that spectrum, the line between legalization and legitimacy, continues to be problematic in a lot of the states that have gone the legalization route.
That is so true. I know we talked a lot about California the other day. Yeah, I mean, California is such a great example because really the law can change under your feet. And in our last season of On Something, we had interviewed a guy who was a longtime illegal pot grower in California. And we sort of talked about what the difference was when the recent legalization passed. And so what he was doing was never legal. But at that time, the county didn't really go after him. After California changed its law and left it up to individual municipalities, his county convened and they decided to restrict cannabis cultivation a lot. And so he and hundreds of other farmers who had been growing it there for like 20 years, because it was like a great climate for it, all of a sudden we're doing something not only very illegal, but something that exposed them to a ton of harassment from their local sheriff. And I think this is the other sort of, it's all political piece of it, is this is a sheriff who showed up a couple of years ago. And before that, the previous sheriff did not see it as worth a ton of time and money to go after these individual pot growers when the valley's full of thousands of them, right? But this new sheriff, backed by the county law, says no, it's worth all this time and effort. And the guy we talked to had sheriffs drive a car through his front gate and put him in a hold and destroy all of his stuff. And the charges are not necessarily, oh, he's a huge drug trafficker. They're able to charge him with small things like code violations and threaten asset seizure. All of this is to say is that I do think it's really interesting to look at states where the law says weed is legal, but local municipalities get to sort of make up their minds. Because I think you have these like stark examples of how drug policy really does make a difference when it is one county next to another county. You can see the difference in terms of just like how people on parole are treated, how officers are trained to deal with cannabis or not. It is a huge deal in terms of just like how it varies from place to place.
I'm going to ask Sarah to jump in here in a second. She had some thoughts that she wanted to add to the conversation, but just one last point on sort of the footprint of how policy can be administered. Kay, when we were doing some pre-conversation for this dialogue, you mentioned that College Park in Fulton County, which is where I grew up, that the entire footprint of College Park was considered a drug-free zone in terms of policy, whether it be from, I guess, the county level or from the prosecutor who manages that level of agency. Just explain what that means, but also, I guess, if you could give some of your perspective on how does that affect or even begin to like acknowledge anyone who lives there living in this space of maybe a criminalized like footprint in a certain type of way.
Sure. So let me say a few words about what we mean by the drug-free zones. This was an idea that came about during the Reagan administration. There was a kind of model federal statute that drafted in the late 80s that was then promoted by the Chief of Police Association. So then we started seeing states across the country adopting these drug-free zone statutes, which add either additional charges or enhanced penalties for people who are caught selling or possessing with intent to sell or trafficking any drug, including marijuana, within the zone. So the most common one we think of is the drug-free school zone, but we also have drug-free public housing zone, public parks, public housing, and then also the drug-free commercial zone, which is meant to protect areas of commercial activity from people selling drugs in the near area. So the College Park situation involves the drug-free commercial zone statute, not the school zone, but the commercial zone statute. The city council of College Park, which is a city inside Fulton County, designated, I think it's 95% of the area of the entire city as a drug-free commercial zone area, meaning anybody caught selling, possessing with intent to sell, or trafficking drugs in basically anywhere in the city of College Park would be subject to the second charge under the Georgia Penal Code, which subjects the defendant to an additional 5 years incarceration and a $20,000 fine. The second penalty, that is if you get convicted once and then convicted again, is even more elaborate. So College Park, as a municipality, decided they wanted to have this heightened penalty because I think they perceived that selling drugs, particularly marijuana and cocaine, was out of control in their borders, and they wanted to send a very strong signal to people: if they're going to sell drugs, go sell it somewhere else, not within our borders. The College Park police received a lot of training, and they were told, anytime you're making an arrest, if you're within the commercial zone, we want to see that charge added as you're forwarding the document to the Fulton County Prosecutor's Office. The data that we collected showed that the Fulton County Prosecutor's Office was not fully on board with this idea. That is, all of the drug arrests coming out of College Park did not necessarily end up in criminal cases that included the drug-free commercial zone charge. And even when they did, even when prosecutors included that charge, very often it got bargained away during plea bargaining, or judges, even if there was a conviction for that charge, did not impose the heightened penalty. So this, to us, was a really interesting example of the state legislature way overstepping the bounds of what localities were actually willing to do in the face of the drug war. So what we hear from prosecutors and some judges, and certainly defense attorneys, is that the baseline penalties for the statutes were harsh enough. Nobody needed an additional 5 years, an additional $20,000 in fines, and certainly, for successive penalties for successive convictions, nobody needed an additional 10 years or 20 years, which is what the statutes were authorizing. So it created this very big gap between what the formal law provided and what local officials who actually had enforcement authority were willing to do. Even when police officers were making the arrests, it really was not being carried through. So, the end result is what do police officers learn from that? it's a whole lot of effort without much payoff. So there's only so much you get from the symbolic value of like, well, you're telling somebody, this is a really big deal, but then their experience through the justice system does not reinforce that it really is such a big deal. What does that do to people? But let's, if we take away the enforcement piece, what does it mean to say that most of College Park, 95% of it, is this hyper criminalized space? Well, you might say, well, that's, drug dealers can choose then. People who are selling drugs could sell somewhere else. They don't want to be subject to those penalties. They should go somewhere else that's not so hyper criminalized. But most of the data we have from criminologists who spend time working with people who are users and sellers of substances on the streets is that most people sell within a very tight radius of where they live. That people are not driving 2 miles, let alone 10 miles or 20 miles away to sell somewhere else. They sell in their neighborhoods. On the one hand, that makes them nuisances in their neighborhoods, and their neighbors may not like that. But also we have to consider the realities of what many of these neighborhoods look like. This is not limited to College Park, but to many of the inner cities across the country. It's not realistic to say, go 10 blocks to the east or 10 blocks to the west and sell somewhere else to get yourself out of the zone, because those areas are controlled by other people running other businesses, and a dealer would put his life at risk by moving into somebody else's turf. So the salience of the turf war is much greater than the salience of the formal law saying you're in the zone. The dealers that we interviewed as part of our research, most of them knew about zones, but they considered them utterly irrelevant. They're just so distant compared to the realities of what they need to do to make their businesses viable and to keep themselves and their families safe. So the laws themselves, the formal laws themselves, were just very, very remote compared to the realities of running that business. And lawmakers never take those kinds of things into account.
Well, at this point, I would love to maybe open it up for more questions. I know, Sarah, you had a couple of questions that you wanted to ask, especially when it comes to how some cities or policymakers may be charting a bit of a different path. So Sarah, over to you.
Thank you. Thank you for the panelists again. So I had one question about drug injection sites, and I would just like to hear your thoughts on that.
Sure. So we actually covered this a little bit in our last season of On Something. Safe injection sites are actually relatively extremely new in America, considering the first one just opened up in New York City last week. Mm-hmm. So other countries have tried this and they have a pretty promising success rate in terms of preventing people from dying of an overdose death, preventable overdose death. And they're part of a larger, broader social movement of harm reduction, which just is really about the idea that you cannot prevent people from doing drugs. All you can do is make it unsafe. And so harm reduction policies seek to make it safer for people to do drugs so that they are less likely to overdose or die or suffer any other health complications. And so safe injection sites are not the only harm reduction policy we're seeing gain popularity. I really want to point to Oregon. Oregon, in their last election, voted to decriminalize personal possession of most drugs and to massively fund state-funded drug treatment. So I think there's a growing interest in these kinds of policies here, for sure.
Do you think?
And I would just add, so sorry, I just wanted to add to, I think safe injection sites also grow on the very solid platform for naloxone training and equipping police officers. Naloxone is a drug that, if injected into somebody who has overdosed on opioid, blocks the effect of heroin on the body. As sort of, I'm not a doctor, but like in a neurotransmitter sense, it blocks the effects of opioids. So thousands of police departments have equipped their police officers with naloxone and have given officers training on how to administer it on site. So again, like you have not prevented the person from injecting the opioid himself or herself. What we're doing is saving that person's life. And once that person his life has been saved, we can then have a conversation about treatment. Yes. And getting the person some resources to move forward. But first we have to save their lives. So I think that also is a not just harm reduction, but it's a much more compassionate approach to understanding people with substance abuse disorders.
Thank you. Whenever you were talking about addiction, and like obviously me being in college, it's like people using drugs isn't, rare. And I was just thinking about how I understand that I feel like if people do it every day, I feel like that is an addiction. But then also I feel like there's people who do it with their friends. And I was just trying to think about, I feel like it's rare that somebody ever does it by themselves. And I was thinking about, it's like almost a bonding activity. And I was wondering if people would still carry on with that if they didn't have those friends who would do it. And what are your thoughts on that?
I think there's some wisdom in that, but I also would just point to the fact that more than half of the country is legalized medicinal cannabis. And so for a lot of people, that is their reason for consuming it alone. I also just like, this might be a little personal belief thing, but I do think culturally speaking, we have a hard time of finding like a middle ground between like not doing drugs and being addicted. And I think this is something like I've gotten questions about this a lot in my role as somebody who covers cannabis predominantly. I think this is kind of like a race issue playing out in real time, right? Because you being in college can probably attest to the fact that alcohol is not something you'd talk about in the same way, perhaps. But it's everywhere. It's everywhere. It's, most social functions are built around alcohol. Only recently is it becoming like cool to not drink. And so we have that, we have tobacco, both of which are like the only exceptions to the Controlled Substances Act, very significant exceptions. My point being that we have socially acceptable addictions all around us. I don't know if you could see because of the blur, but I have coffee. And so I think it's really important, like when we talk about, harm reduction, we talk about these ideas that really force us to reevaluate how we look at drug users. I think it's also really important to extend that to how we look at drug use. I don't know if the question is doing it every day, does that make you an addict? I think it's much more like a personal issue. It's about whether or not that substance is interfering with your life, is interfering with your relationships, is interfering with your commitments to a job or to school. That is what addiction actually looks like. But I mean, this may be controversial for me to say as a journalist. Like, I don't know. I don't think there's anything wrong with smoking weed every day. I think it just vastly depends on like a number of other factors, whether or not you're addicted. And I think, again, it's much more important to me to be thoughtful about your consumption in the greater context of everything else you're doing than it is for you to ask yourself every day, like, am I addicted? Am I addicted? Am I an addict?
Thank you. And last but not least, I guess this would be a very wide question to ask, but what do you think is the best next move for the federal government to make in terms of drug policy?
We both made the same face.
Wow. So I will put a plug in for an approach that I am fascinated by, that I've sort of recently come upon in the last couple of years. It's happening. It's again, the origination is at a local level, not federally, but if there was federal support for it, it would spread. And that's called deflection. So, the normal path for somebody with substance abuse issues is going to get arrested by a police officer, prosecuted, go through the courts, and then, end up on probation or sent to prison. And so, whether they get help or not is maybe up to them, maybe up to the terms of their probation or parole, or what sorts of rehab facilities are available inside their carceral setting. About 20 to 30 years ago, we started creating diversion programs, which generally are run by prosecutors. So somebody gets arrested, a case gets filed against them, and then prosecutors give them the chance to get rehab, subject to a list of terms and conditions that look a lot like what probation looks like. And if they successfully complete, then the case gets dismissed and it doesn't end up on their record. But if they don't successfully complete, they get fully prosecuted. Deflection Alternatives, which we largely attribute starting in Seattle with a program called LEAD. Deflection initiatives say, let's not arrest that person in the first place. When there's a point of intercept for somebody who's got a substance abuse disorder, who's located out in public, either because they've just overdosed or some neighbor has seen them, in a storefront or wandering around on the sidewalk, police officers come, and their goal at that point is to talk to the person about an alternative. And that alternative is police officers saying, let me call a caseworker for you. And many times the caseworkers are former addicts themselves, who will then come on site and assess this person who is experiencing some difficulty and get that person into treatment right then. And usually often with the help of families or friends. But many times these initiatives require significant funding from municipalities, and they definitely require partnerships between the prosecutor's office, the public defenders, first responders, rehab facilities, public health facilities, et cetera. So deflection alternatives, again, we can trace it back to LEAD in Seattle, but the LEAD model has now proliferated a number of places across the country: New Mexico, Albany. Atlanta has a version of this that's called PAD here. It's been in existence since 2017. There's a model in Gloucester, Massachusetts, which is located near Boston. The model in Gloucester, police officers have put out the call publicly to say to people, if you have a substance abuse problem and you want to get treatment, you want to get help, come to us, and there's no judgment, there's no prosecution. We will get you into treatment right then. So we have another kind of program in Houston where officers go to the hospital after somebody has survived an overdose attempt, again with a caseworker to get them into treatment. So we have a lot of different models that people are innovating across the country, and we put them all under this umbrella of deflection, because it means we don't pull this person into the justice system just to shuttle them out. We want to keep them out of the system entirely. And we know how important this is, because even an arrest generates stigma. It gets you in a database. Those databases proliferate. That information is available to future employers, future landlords. It can be very hard to scrub a web footprint of even just an arrest without a conviction. So if we can keep people out of the system in the first place, and get them help that they want, it's all voluntary, we get them the help that they want, we see much better outcomes in terms of recidivism, their feeling about the justice system, the things we think of as procedural justice, how individuals and communities feel about their relationship to state actors and whether they've been respected, and we can sort of build trust instead of the deterioration that we've seen in so many communities. So I would say, if I could, wave my magic wand, I would say to the Biden administration and Merrick Garland and the Justice Department right now is take a very close look at deflection alternatives and fund these things. And we will see the payoff for years to come.
Thank you.
Jumping right off of that, first of all, I love that. And I want to shout back to that law in Oregon, because that's a lot of what that newer law does, is if you are caught with over a certain amount of a drug, you get like a small citation, and then you are asked whether you ought to be connected to services. I think too, the issue of a criminal conviction, I think, is so much more pressing than a lot of people realize, especially for as broad of an impact that the drug war has had on people. We have perfectly legal discrimination in this country for people who have criminal records, particularly if you are a felon. And so people who are walking around with drug convictions can still be legally discriminated against for housing, for employment, for federal student loans, for childcare. There's thousands, literally thousands of ways that a criminal conviction interacts with those other needs. So my biggest thing is some type of national relief for people who have drug convictions like that. I think actually Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez just proposed something like this very recently. But I think that's crucial. I think only a couple places in this country are offering that type of relief to people who have criminal convictions, and it's life-changing. It really is. So I think that is something that I would love to see. I really think that decriminalization is something that we need to look at more as a nation. I think when you look at other countries that have tried this, like Portugal, for example, decriminalized all drugs, I believe in 2005. It's a success story. It's a way that more people who really need it are connected with treatment. They're connected with what is considered to be the gold standard in addiction treatment, particularly for opiates, which is medication assisted treatment. And people are more likely to take those referrals to services when there isn't a criminal element to it. And then just by and large, like I think too, we have so much evidence that shows us that there are racial disparities at every step of the criminal process, in particular when it pertains to drugs. We're talking who gets stopped, who gets searched, who gets arrested, who gets convicted, who gets a plea deal, how long the sentences are. I am personally just very much in favor of moving drug policy as much out of the criminal realm as possible and making it solely a public health issue. I think it is life or death, especially when you see how many more opioid overdose deaths we've had during the pandemic compared to previous years. We have ample evidence that criminalization does not work. It does not stop people from doing drugs. It doesn't stop people from dying. It does not. We can have a whole other debate about this another day, but it doesn't actually drive down crime rates either. And so I think that's something I would love to see in my lifetime, is just a shift away from that.
Thank you so much.
Thanks to all of you for spending some time with us this afternoon. We have one last question, but I did want to just give a bit of a closeout and ask if we could have 2 more minutes of your time. This conversation is brought to you by Science Gallery Atlanta in support of our Hooked season. I'm Floyd Hall. I'm the co-curator of this Hooked season, along with Hannah Redler-Hawes. Hooked opens in spring of 2022. I have my Science Gallery sweater on here. So just thankful for everyone spending some time with us this afternoon. And this conversation will be rebroadcast and linked to all over the social ecosystem. But one last question before we get out of here, and this came from Audrey Chang. This question is about how is addictiveness addressed for policymakers and researchers? And also, how do researchers account for variance within populations in addictiveness? So
I could say, just sort of generally, addictiveness is it's not a term of art. It's not a scientific term that Congress takes account of. What they talk about, the language that governs the Controlled Substances Act is high potential for abuse. High potential for abuse. But is there a rigorous standard and any kind of definition that you could put on a flashcard about that? There is not. At least nothing in what I have seen. So that is what allows the slippage from, there are a lot of recreational users of marijuana, to marijuana has a high potential for abuse, despite the physiological impacts. Drug addiction researchers, that people who work in the public health or medical space, have a way of thinking about addiction, which is the way, like, it transforms the body biochemically, it transforms the brain biochemically. But those kinds of transformations do not appear as any kind of standard in federal or, frankly, state statutes that I'm aware of.
Yeah, it's really important to point out that in 1967, when we decided what drugs would be legal and illegal federally, it was still commonly accepted that cannabis was a gateway drug that caused you to do who knows what else. And so I just really love telling people that laws don't have to be scientifically accurate in this country. They rarely ever are.
Oh, wait, actually, as an epilogue, there actually was even a point, there are some Supreme Court cases early on that said, from the state Supreme Courts, that the laws that Congress passed do not need to be factually accurate. Again, these are the state legislatures, do not need to be factually accurate as long as a rational person could believe that these things are true. So that courts expressly acknowledging they don't actually need to have any real factual basis as long as a rational person could believe that. So it was rational for early state legislatures to think that the use of cocaine would make somebody impervious to a bullet, or the use of marijuana would increase somebody's sex drive. Rational to believe that, even though wholly baseless, as a matter of fact.
It just depends on who you are.
That's a great place to leave it. This has been Drugs in Your Neighborhood, Race, Place, and Community. Thank you, Kay. Thank you, Ann Marie. Thank you, Sarah. Hopefully you all enjoyed this conversation, speaking to our audience here. And I would love to revisit this. I think this is a great start of a dialogue for us at Science Gallery Atlanta, but I would love to revisit this conversation in the spring once the exhibition is open, because I think that there might be, you know, subsequent conversations and tangential sort of dialogues that may sort of shoot off from this. And I want to sort of save some space for that, because I think this is super important for people to really talk about. I think from a public health perspective, from a legal perspective, and from just a perspective of increasing our awareness of the range of how agency is distributed throughout our country, our cities, and our communities. So thank you all for this conversation. Looking forward to the next time. And again, thank you.